my name is Jennifer and welcome to a Vintage Vanity. I'm super excited for today's video because, well, you guys are here. And today we are not celebrating February. No, we are celebrating Loungeuary. And you might be asking, like, what exactly is that? And that is just a thing where I called up some of my favorite internet people and I said, hey, would you like to join me in sewing up some fabulous loungewear in February? Because cute and comfy is kind of where I'm at, and I am so pleased that some of my favorite people have decided to join in, and we have Bianca, Stephanie, Haley, and Liz. So I am going to link to all their channels in the description, and there will also be a playlist as well to check out all their fabulous makes. I've only seen like little hints of what they're making, and let me tell you, I am so excited and I cannot wait to see what everybody makes. I feel like I'm being super weird with my hands today because I'm trying to hide the fact that one of my nails fell off. Pay no attention to that thumb. I have so many vintage loungewear patterns that it was really tough to decide what I actually wanted to make, but I decided that I was going to push myself and use a type of pattern I have never used before, and I was also going to push myself into working with a fabric that I really haven't worked with before, which was a great idea at the beginning. And then led to a lot of anxiety and hand-wringing and procrastination. But I will tell you, I am in love with how this turned out. And also, I think I may have found my favorite way to pattern grade. If you guys saw my last antique haul, you saw that I picked up this 1947 housecoat pattern from Marion Martin. And I was super excited to work with this because I've never, number one, worked with a pattern this old, but it is also one of the patterns that has very limited sewing instructions. There is 12 steps. That's it. It's all the instructions. And also there's no printing on the patterns. It's really just perforations. So I was really excited to try my hand at working with one of these vintage patterns. And can I just say, I absolutely loved it. I found the patterns super easy to work with. I didn't always know what some of the marks meant, but because I've worked with so many patterns in the past, I was able to figure it out. And not having a lot of directions didn't really bother me. It just gave me like a gist for order of operations, and I was able to figure everything out as I went. I really wouldn't recommend this for somebody who's just starting out sewing because there's not a lot of information in there. With that said, I picked up two of these, one of which is a bust 38, the other of which is a bust 34. Neither of those are anywhere close to my measurements. In fact, we are looking at, with the largest pattern, a 10-inch difference in just the waist circumference. What that meant for me was that I was not going to use my regular technique of hack and slash, because that only works up to a couple inches, because when you start talking about like a 10-inch difference, you're talking about the entire pattern changes. So I had to figure out a new way of doing this, and as I said earlier, it might be my favorite way of doing it now. But yeah, so that was a challenge. So most of this video is really going to focus on the pattern grading and the redrafting of these patterns. There's a little bit of sewing thrown in, but most of it is focused on the drafting. And I do have chapters, which you will find in the description. So, what mysterious fabric did I choose that I have never worked with before? I chose an embroidered sequined sheer fabric, and this required that I work with an underlayer. So I actually ended up choosing a cotton broadcloth. I cannot pronounce words today. A cotton broadcloth. And the reason why I did that is because I am somebody who tends to run warm, so I wanted a housecoat that was really light and breezy. So I went with a much lighter fabric, and I really enjoy the choice. And I decided to lean more into the blue aspect than this kind of tealy blue-green. So I really kind of love the combo, and I think you're gonna love that too. And then it was time to get started. And let me tell you, I did all of the overthinking that there was. And once that was tapped out, then I went ahead and became best friends with procrastination. And when I figured I couldn't procrastinate any longer, I decided to become completely overwhelmed by all of it. And then I finally sat down and said, just do something, anything. Even if it's wrong, just do it. Have I become a Nike commercial all of a sudden? I knew I had to grade everything up by 10 inches. So now, normally what I do when pattern grading is I will kind of slash and spread the pattern to add that extra room in. But because 2.5 inches is way too big to be doing that, I had to come up with another way of adding those inches in. So while my brain was busy trying to figure out how exactly I was going to do that, I decided to jump right in and to transfer those pattern pieces onto craft paper so I could play with them and mark them up and not ruin the original pattern pieces. And in the process of doing that, I determined that the easiest way to do this was going to be working off of a pre-existing pattern. I decided to use the bodice patterns from the Charm Night and Day dress, which I had just used to create my Christmas dress. So I knew it fit really, really well. And I will place a link on the screen to the video for the making of that dress. And I also liked that this dress had the darts at the waist and bust line, just like the vintage pattern. Now the neckline was completely different, so I would need to tweak this. But because of those reasons, I thought this would be a really great block pattern to work off of. With those two pattern pieces traced, it really was just a process of looking at that vintage pattern and figuring out what changes I would need to make to the charm pattern. And from this point on, with that charm pattern, I'm either going to call it the charm pattern or I may refer to it as a block pattern, because really that's in essence how I'm treating it, as just a block bodice that I'm making adjustments to. I knew from the illustration that the neckline was on an angle and also that the waistline overlapped center front. So the only thing I knew to be true to center front was that point at the waistline. So from there, I had to then figure out what else could have been a center front marking. And I surmised that one of the two sets of dots had to be center front. And then after going back to the illustration again, I realized that that center front kind of cuts right through that neckline. So it makes sense that the two closest to the neckline are going to also be center front. So once I did that, I just drew my line, and now I had a vertical line that I could use to make any changes from. I then had to determine a horizontal line I could work off of, and I assumed that the buttons would have been in a straight line, so that would be the perfect place to draw my horizontal line. And I used my vertical line to make sure that my horizontal line would be as straight as possible. The biggest difference between the two front bodice pieces was that there is this section of overlap on the vintage pattern piece. Because of the way the housecoat kind of overlaps itself, I needed to accommodate for that section of the pattern that went past center front. To do that, I measured the distance from the center front line to the side seam. Then I measured the distance from the center front to the edge of the neckline. Knowing those measurements allowed me to determine that the overlap was approximately 1/3 of the waist measurement from the center front to the side seam. And then that way I could then transfer those same ratios over to my pattern block. On my charm pattern, I measured from the center front to the side seam, and that turned out to be 14 1/8 inches. Oh, look at them toe beans! Look at the toe beans! Look at them toe beans! I took that measurement and divided by 3 and came up with 4 5/8, and that will be the width of our overlap. And now all I had to do was simply draw out that overlap. So this is this here. Now that I know where my overlap is and kind of where that straight line is, I still have to do this bottom part, but I want to figure out this angle first. I started off by lining up the smaller pattern with the larger pattern at the waistline, but then also made sure that when it got towards the shoulder that the center front line was lining up. I want this angle to kind of stay the same, but I need to bring it over to my overlap. So I'm going to remove this pattern weight, and I am going to hold it down over here and just boop, 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 move that over. And now we have our new neckline. Okay, we're going to change things, you guys. We do this, and we go from like here all the way up here. It is almost the same length. It's just a little bit higher. That tells me we want to make sure that this angle crosses our center line at the same, pretty much the same point. So let's do this. Let's line these two puppies up. That ends up right here. Why this is important is we're kind of dealing with this V in the front, and we want that to hit at the right spot and not be too high. We're going to change our angle so that we actually hit right at that point. So that, as we can tell, opens up that neck a lot more, which I feel a lot better about. Let's do the next easy thing, our buttonholes. On here, our first buttonhole started 5/8 of an inch away from the dart. So that's the same thing we're going to do here. And then I'm going to go 1 inch on that. Have our first button / buttonhole marked. We do have one more button to mark on the pattern, but we are going to do that a little later. But I am going to go ahead and use my owl to punch holes right through those buttonholes to make it easier to transfer. So now I want to draft in that point that comes at the waistline. So I'm going to measure the distance from the waistline to the tip of the point, which turns out to be 2 2/8 inches. Then we are going to lengthen our center front line by that measurement of 2 2/8. So basically, now this point here is this point here, this point here is this point here. So now we just need to draw a line. Now we just need to complete what is the overlap side of this. To cut out the pattern piece, I simply folded back the overlap section along the center front line. Then I was able to just flip it over and then trace out the shape of the bottom of the bodice so that I had a perfect mirror of the right side of the bodice. And because that section does cross over inside the dart, I went ahead and pinched that together and then completed drawing the line. Then I took my owl and punched through the buttonholes so that our buttons would be even. And now we have a brand new bodice front pattern that is drafted to my measurements. So here are the two back bodice pieces side by side. If we take a look at the vintage pattern, what we're seeing here is that there is a dart here at the waist. There is a very simple, very close neckline here. And we see that the center back is going to a point. So we kind of have that same repetition of the point on the front. Looks like it's on the back as well. So we want to make sure that those are the key points we take from this pattern and place onto this pattern. The one thing about this pattern that makes it not the most perfect pattern to be using for this is the neckline. This is actually more of like a rounded boat neckline. So we are going to have to tweak the neckline on that just a little. Before I adjust the neckline, I need to address the shoulder. The shoulder on the front bodice piece is actually wider than here on the back bodice block. So I'm simply going to match them up at the shoulder seam, and then that way I can sketch out the width of that new shoulder. Then I'm also going to transfer the registration mark so it'll make it easier to match the two pattern pieces up later. I have the perfect solution for this neckline, and that is another pattern piece. This is the pattern piece that I used for the peplum top that I just did. I'll link on the screen for that video. But if you look here, that neckline is very, very similar to this neckline that we see here. So I think this is going to be really good. We're going to bring this over to the shoulder and kind of match the angle of the shoulder. We're going to ignore everything else and just match that angle of the shoulder, and then just do a new neckline like so, like that. Then we're just going to extend our center back, extend that over. So now this is our new neckline. And this line here is the new neckline. You can tell I had to attempt it a couple times until I found just the right fit. To add the center dip on the pattern, I'm actually going to be using my front bodice so that I can replicate the same exact angle. I match up the center back, and then I'm going to match the waistlines. So, boom. I'm just going to match those two up. Perfect, right? And then all I have to do is trace around that. And there we go. You'll also want to indicate that this is to be cut on the fold. We have our bodice back is all set up and ready to be cut out. Next up, we have the facing, which should be pretty easy. I'm just lining this up to kind of see where the facing stops, and it stops right inside what would be the dart right now, and it goes a little less than half of the width of the shoulder. So knowing that, that's all I need to know from that. So I'm going to set that aside and grab my craft paper. I laid the front bodice down on top of the craft paper so I could trace out an outline. I also transferred the buttonhole marks just because I love a straight line that I can work off of. And I know that on the old pattern, the facing came out about 1.25 inches from the buttonhole, which I think the buttonhole is a good, I don't think it matters based on size, so I think it's still going to be 1.25 inches. So we're just going to go ahead and measure that, and then that's where the facing is going to stop. And with that, our front facing pattern is complete. Okay, now we're going to move on to my nemesis, which is the sleeve. And I am going to be doing the short sleeve version of this housecoat. Well, technically I don't need to cut out the sleeve pattern because I already have the sleeve pattern, and it is this one. And there's really not a lot of allowance down here to do like a band or anything, but that is okay because, like I said, I have a plan for that, and I cannot wait to show you guys. And we are down to our very last pattern piece to draft, and that is the collar. We're going to be using the registration mark on the bodice and matching it to that on the collar. That will ensure that the point of the collar is sitting on the bodice the way it should. So now we need to determine how much we need to lengthen the collar by. We are going to need to make sure we lengthen it below the registration mark so that it reaches the bottom of the bodice, but also above the registration mark so that it reaches all the way around the back of our neck. The first thing I did was actually trace the neckline of the front bodice so that I could make sure that the collar length would match that of the bodice. Then, using a copy of the original collar piece, I actually just marked 2 lines, one below the registration mark and one above. So those would be my cutting lines, so I could actually eventually spread out the collar to match the tracing of the front bodice. I then used those 3 pieces to help sketch out the shape of the new collar. I also made sure to line up the middle piece with the registration mark so that the point of the collar hit at the same area of the chest. Now, to check the fit of the new pattern piece collar, I'm going to take the front and back bodice and line them up at the shoulder seam. I will want to overlap the two pieces at the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so it pretty much will lay like it would be if it was sewn together. Then starting at the bottom of the front bodice, I'm just going to simply march the collar piece up and kind of pivot around the neckline just to make sure that everything is lining up properly. You'll notice at this point that I haven't even addressed the bottom of the housecoat, and that is because I want to wait until the bodice is done, because the top of those skirt pieces are an exact mirror to the bodice piece. So until I have that tweaked and I know that that is perfect, I don't even want to mess with the skirt. Honestly, you guys, this is the most nervous I have been for a mock-up in a really long time, but it is also the most confident I have ever felt for a mock-up. So I guess time for the truth. Let's mock it up. And that wasn't so bad at all. The only little tweaks that I want to make to it is to the back collar. Because that collar was a little more straight, it actually ended up riding up and looked like, you know, a preppy popped collar in the back, which, you know, don't get me wrong, you know I'm loving popped collars right now, but not in my house coats. So I am going to change the way the back neck piece is drafted on the collar. The other thing was that the collar was too shallow. I really wanted this to be a dramatic collar, so I actually ended up, I want to say, adding about 2 inches to the width of the collar to make it a bit of a moment. As far as fit goes, it fit absolutely perfectly. But here's the thing. I'm probably going to want to wear this house coat over a set of pajamas. So then I tried it on with a set of pajamas on, and it was way too snug. And the snugness mostly was at the waistline. And loungewear is all about comfort and looking cute. So I needed to hit that comfort level. So what I decided to do was add more room at the waist. And to do that was really easy because those waist darts were pretty large. So I just made all the waist darts a 1-inch dart width. To make the needed adjustments to the collar, I went ahead and traced out the collar and then decided to use once again, the charm pattern night and day dress. And this is the scarf collar, and decided to trace out the back portion. So just the portion that goes around the back of the neck. And as you can tell, there's a much bigger curve to this pattern, and I knew it would lay flat on the back of my neck rather than standing up. Here you can see a side-by-side of the collar that I used for the mock-up and then the newly drafted collar. Not only did I add that curve to the back neck area, I also increased the width of the collar as well. For the embroidered fabric, the selvage edges were this beautiful trim, and I took a moment to figure out what I wanted to be the top of the fabric and then the bottom of the fabric. And after I decided that, I went ahead and cut off the trim from the top of the fabric, not only so that I'd always remember what direction the fabric was to go in, but also so that I could then utilize that trim for the bottom edge of the skirt and also for around the collar. And now it's time to start cutting out our fabric. This may seem like a very inefficient way of using this material, but I am going to go ahead and cut out my sleeve because I want this trim detail to be at the very bottom of the sleeve. And what I did is, since this is a standard sleeve, which would typically have a hem to it, I marked off that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to fold this over because we are not going to be finishing the hem on these sleeves because the trim detail is essentially the hem. Oh my gosh, how cute is that gonna look? Now it's time to move on to the skirt portion, and I'm going to start with the front skirt, and I'm laying down the front bodice on the edge of my craft paper so that I can trace the bottom edge of that front bodice. One thing that I'm not really sure that you see very clearly is that when I'm tracing that bottom portion and I get to the dart, I actually hold my pen at that moment and then move to the other side of the dart. Because remember, the skirt is going to be stitched on after your darts have been sewn up, so you don't want the bottom to be too big. Here I'm just laying the original skirt pattern down so I can see what kind of angle the skirt has at the center front. And we can see that it is just a straight line down, so that's easy enough to trace. Instead of trying to calculate out the fullness of the skirt, I went ahead and cheated it a little bit by taking that pattern piece and pushing it all the way to the other side of the bodice, and then I simply traced out the edge of the skirt. I mean, is it cheating or is it just working smarter and not harder? You'll have to let me know in the comments. And then I adjusted it to the length that I needed. And then you have to thank your pattern weights for doing such a good job. And then I repeated the process for the skirt back. The only difference with this pattern is that this pattern would be cut out on the fold. Now it's time to start putting together the bodice and the collar pieces. I have stitched together the skirt pieces at the side seams. For the lining, I actually did the side hems as well. And then I also stitched together the sequined fabric at the side seams as well. The final touch for our skirt was to attach the trim to the very edge of the sheer fabric to finish off the hem. It is all stitched together, so I think it's time to change into something a little more comfortable. I know after that you guys are going to want even more loungeweary goodness, so be sure and stop by and check out Haley, Stephanie, Liz, and Bianca's makes as well. You're going to find their links in the description, and if I've done it properly, a link to the playlist right there. And also, if you'd like to share any of your loungewear makes, we would love to see them, so go ahead and hashtag Loungeuary here on YouTube or Instagram. Now, of course, I love hearing from you guys, so go ahead in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought of today's video, and would you wear sequined loungewear? I don't know, I'm really excited to wear it in Vegas. I can't wait. And of course, before I let you go, a huge subscriber shout out to Heather Rule. Thank you so much for watching, liking, and commenting on my videos, and just for being a part of our cozy little online community. Now, if you're gonna miss this face between uploads, be sure and follow me on all the social media as a Vintage Vanity. If you want to keep watching more of my content, just go ahead and click that video you see right there. Of course, if you don't want to miss out on anything that goes on this channel, on this channel, go ahead and click on that subscribe button. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye.